Here's my question. What is the FBI hiding? Watch this.
We just had an explosion out there. It blew up in the air, and then we saw two fireballs go down into the water.
On July 17th, 1996, TWA Flight 800 exploded in the sky.
A missile or some kind of streaking object was seen in the sky at the same time TWA Flight 800 exploded.
I saw an object rise out of the ocean.
It was moving very rapidly.
And then start climbing, passing my altitude, and the explosion.
And the very next day, the FBI came to talk to me and said, "You did not see that. You saw nothing."
The TWA Flight 800 in-flight breakup was initiated by a fuel-air explosion in the center wing tank.
We didn't find any part of the airplane that indicated a mechanical failure.
The explosive forces came from outside the airplane, not the center fuel tank.
The FBI did all the interviewing of eyewitnesses.
No witness was ever allowed to testify.
For that kind of cover-up to be tolerated, it makes me fighting mad.
TWA Flight 800, an Epic's original documentary.
CBS investigative reporter Kristina Borjesson was on that story when that plane crashed, 230 people died. But the FBI weirdly got involved and halted her ability to get to the facts. And CBS complied and said, you can't cover this. Kristina's going to join me live and get to the bottom of what's really going on with the FBI. Since she left CBS, she's on to other investigations. We're going to dig all the way into it. Before she comes on live, shout out to the sponsor of my coverage. Now gas is $7 a gallon in some areas, and 10-year-old Honda Civics will set you back $20,000. Rent, $2,000 a month. Welcome to 8.6% inflation, and it doesn't look like it's getting better anytime soon. What can you do? You can try trading stock or buy mutual funds, but returns are sinking fast. You'd have to make at least 10% with charges just to break even. You might have heard about gold IRAs, but don't know much about them. That's why Noble Gold has a team of experts at the other end of the phone. They'll put you straight on what you can and can't do to get yourself to financial safety again. And if you're quick, they'll be giving away an incredible 1/10 ounce American Eagle gold proof coin with every qualifying IRA or 401k rollover. You can't go wrong with Noble Gold. Call the team now, 877-646-5347, or find out more by visiting noblegoldinvestments.com. Link down in my description gets you your free gold guide. All right, I'm excited to introduce you guys to Kristina Borjesson, formerly of CBS National News. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Ivory.
And now you run the Whistleblower newsroom. You have a radio show, and you're still on the case of what is not being covered and needs to be exposed as an investigative journalist. So first things first, my viewers were really interested in what happened in 1996. I guess it was 26 years ago this month. We're almost at the anniversary. So TWA Flight 800 crashes, killing 230 people. You were assigned to that story. Take me through what happened. And by the way, viewers, a lot of you guys were asking about the passenger list. Was this thing missiled down? Kristina has a passenger list too. We'll get to that, but take me through the story.
Actually, the plane exploded in midair on its way to Paris right after it took off, practically, off the coast of Long Island. And actually, it's not just what the FBI is hiding, because the CIA was on scene right away. The FBI was on scene right away. Of course, the National Transportation Safety Board was on scene, and the Navy was on scene. So I was assigned to look into it, and I was working with a guy named Paul Raganese. He was CBS's law enforcement consultant, who happened to be a bomb squad and former NYPD bomb squad guy. And he knew these divers who were good Navy divers, not the Navy divers, but NYPD divers who were going to go down and dive with the Navy divers. But the Navy divers came from the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit from Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. And for a week, they dove by themselves. Nobody was allowed to go in there with them. And the NYPD divers were a little skeptical about that. Then they were allowed to dive, but only in prescribed areas. So Paul was very suspicious, and he spoke to them. And the word at the NTSB and among the divers was, well, this is probably a bomb or a missile. So, the FBI is coming in to check out whether it was a crime scene, basically. Because the only way the FBI is allowed to take over an investigation is if they have a reason to believe that the circumstances are criminal. The FBI never officially told the NTSB we're coming in because a crime has occurred, or we have reason to believe a crime has occurred. They never did that officially. Anyway, I was sent I was assigned to look into the crash, and I was sent a piece of seat foam from inside the investigation. They came from a party to the investigation who wanted a journalist to test it. And the journalist, I happen to know him. He was a former cop married to a TWA employee who said, look, you have a bigger platform. Will you test this? They say it's solid rocket missile fuel. I've already had an elemental analysis done, and it looks like solid rocket missile fuel. And I said, look, if this is BS, you're going to be exposed big time. I hope you don't mind, but I'll do it. He FedExed it to me, and apparently the FBI had been surveilling him. And the minute I received it, I put it in my desk. I got 60 minutes, Josh Howard's approval to have it tested. And about a day or two later, the FBI showed up and said I had a piece of stolen material, which it hadn't been stolen. And CBS just gave it right back, and I got my walking papers shortly thereafter.
So they fired you?
They let me go.
And this was going to be featured on 60 Minutes.
I was going to do a piece for 60 Minutes.
So
I actually
did 60 Minutes ever cover it?
Not in the way I was going to cover it. I actually did an interview with the guy who sent me the piece of seat foam. I did an interview, and I went down to what's called the fishbowl, which is where all the news, Dan Rather's evening news cast people who write the stories and so on are, and also the editors and so on. And one of the top guys there, he was on the phone with somebody with the Washington correspondent who was saying, we're not going to air this interview. This interview will not be aired. And this was an interview with Jim Sanders, who was the former cop who was introduced to the guy inside the official government investigation who had sent him the piece of seat foam that had this red residue on it that he subsequently had tested and then wanted me to test. So it was clear from the very beginning that a cover-up was underway. Clear.
Wow.
And so I was let go after being told I had such a brilliant future there because I had won an Emmy the year before, and I was up for another Emmy that year. And I was actually brought into John Klein's office and told what a brilliant future I had.
And who was John Klein?
John Klein had become, I think he'd become, he wasn't president of CBS News. I forget. He had been bumped up, and he had a documentary unit too. Anyway, he had brought me in and said I had this brilliant future, and then boom, this happened, and I was out. And
so here you are, an Emmy-winning correspondent. Yeah. And they abruptly let you go.
Just a reporter, not a correspondent.
Oh, okay. And what was their reasoning?
For
letting you go?
I didn't get a reason. And the only reason I tell you, I felt like my soul was sucked out. And what happened was all of a sudden my phone started ringing. I started getting calls from all over, from reporters in the US and from other places like Japan. And I thought, well, how did that happen? And somebody at CBS, because my cootie factor was very high once everybody knew what had happened to me, that the FBI had come, and wow. CBS, without so much as a word or a question, just gave that piece back. And so nobody would talk to me or whatever, but somebody called around, and all of a sudden I was getting calls from journalists who wanted me. A Current Affair. I don't know if you remember. You're too young to remember that show, but it was one of those, Inquirer type TV shows. They were among the first to call. But yeah, so, and after that, I just wanted to forget about it, but I couldn't because my son was a 10-year-old unaccompanied minor on Air France, 5 minutes behind TWA on the same track that TWA was on when it blew up. And my neighbor had called me when it happened and said, "Was that your son on the plane?" And for a moment, I didn't know what plane she was talking about. And I can't describe the feeling that I had. It was like hot oil poured on my brain. I just started dry heaving and vomiting, and I remembered that feeling. So I've remembered that feeling up until now. It's very immediate, even when I talk about it. And I think that's what helped me, not help me, but forced me to persist.
You could so relate to
Completely.
the families of the dead because you thought your son was one of them for a moment.
Completely. Yes. Yeah. For a minute, I thought my son was one of them.
So you had a great resume, and I read that ABC ended up wanting to work with you after that.
I know. I got this call, and this guy says to me, this producer, he says, "Hey, Kristina, I want you to tell the story of TWA. We're doing it's a new series. It's called Declassified. They were just doing just a pilot, Ivory, just a pilot. So I had a 12-minute piece to do for this pilot. And this was going to be on the entertainment side, but it was going to be like a very slick 60 minutes on the entertainment side. And it was going to be hosted by Oliver Stone. And so I was like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do the TWA thing. And he goes, no. I said, well, what makes you think I'll be able to tell the story that I want to tell? He goes, oh, consider this a ripping reality. You'll be able to tell it. And I was like, okay. Literally, I start planning this eyewitness shoot, a group eyewitness shoot with my co-producer, Kelly O'Meara, another investigative reporter. And our car gets broken into at night when we arrive in New York. They take her computer and all our TWA papers and leave everything else behind, golf clubs, other expensive items in the trunk. By the way, very clean job. They didn't destroy the lock. And then a few days later, we were told to stand down, that we were no longer going to do this show. They would stand down. And then about a few days later, even, there was a spate of press, Ivory. Oliver Stone, conspiracy crank Oliver Stone is going to do a show on TWA. This was New York Times. It was Newsweek. It was Daily News. It was all these major papers that just like in line, like little soldiers, came out with the same story about conspiracy crank Oliver Stone. I hadn't even spoken to Oliver about what I was going to do.
Wow.
He had no idea.
Wow.
And I actually wrote, it was Periscope and Newsweek, and I actually wrote to them and I said, I was assigned to do this piece. I don't give a damn what Oliver Stone thinks about what's going on with TWA. He hired me because I've been looking into this and I'm an investigative reporter. And I'm sure that he knows that I'm just going to pursue the truth. Anyway, no response or anything like that. But so this was a very orchestrated thing. And that's when I started realizing this is a very big deal. They don't want the truth to come out. But again, it's not just the FBI.
So someone notified all the media in unison to push out a story that makes fun of ABC for covering this, basically.
Yes.
Peer pressuring ABC out of covering it.
And not only did they shut down the TWA story, they shut down the entire series.
Wow.
And Oliver Stone, who did JFK and got all kinds of grief for that for years and years and years, told the producer who hired me, This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me professionally.
Wow. Wow. And how long after the crash was that?
It was a few years. It was a few years after that. I can't remember exactly.
So you were in the process, you said you were doing a group eyewitness interview. I think you've mentioned before that there were dozens of eyewitnesses who saw what appeared to be 3 missiles, is what I read.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. There are eyewitnesses who saw the origin of a streak of light that went up to the plane. And I think there were 120 of them, around 120, if I recall correctly. 96 said that streak of light originated on the Earth's surface. Okay. And that was a big problem. That was a big problem for the FBI. It was a big problem for the CIA in particular, which is why the CIA got involved in preparing an animation that showed that the eyewitnesses did not see what they said they saw. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses, hundreds. But what the CIA did, and if you go on YouTube, Tom Stalcup, a physicist, he actually broke down how they put together their ruse, because the FBI used the CIA's animation to back out of the investigation. What they did was, sound takes time to travel. Mm-hmm. So the people who actually saw the originating event, the streak going up to the, didn't hear any explosions first. They saw this thing and exploded, and then they heard the explosion. The CIA conveniently put those eyewitnesses in a black box. They only focused on eyewitnesses who heard something and then looked up. And by that time, the originating event had occurred. So that's how they managed to pull the wool over the eyes of the public. And that was very convenient for the FBI to pull itself away. And that's probably why the FBI would not allow the National Transportation Safety Board, who had a legal mandate to investigate this crash on its own, but allowed the FBI to take over based on, it's a criminal event, even though the FBI never officially gave them the word about the circumstances that made them think, which they have to do before they start their investigation. But this was bigger than the paychecks of the top people at the National Transportation Safety Board, clearly, because the CIA was involved and also DOD was involved.
So after years-long investigation, I read that the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, which, by the way, they're always in charge of investigating any sort of plane crash.
Yeah, they're the premier plane crash agency in the world.
And I've dealt with them as I've covered plane crashes throughout my career. But they finally came out. I read that they finally came out saying that it was some sort of mechanical malfunction inside the plane, something, a spark originating inside the plane.
In the fuel tank. They said, basically they said that because the airplane had been sitting on the tarmac for a long time, there was very little fuel in the center wing fuel tank. And so it kind of vaporized. And then there were some frayed wires. Possibly there were some frayed wires in the fuel tank that rubbed up against each other and caused a spark and blew up the fuel tank. Now, the reason why that's ridiculous, first of all, they admitted they never found any wiring that did any frayed wiring or anything like that. They just posited that. The other thing is all the forensic evidence that points to a very high explosive event, not what's called a deglaffration. Oh God, forget the word. But anyway, it's a low order explosion. It would have been a low order explosion in the fuel tank. This explosion that caused the TWA to explode was on the order of ordnance, explosive ordnance, because when that plane got hit, stuff came out of that plane at more than 4 times the speed of sound. That's a lot of energy. A little explosion in the fuel tank cannot cause that. The other thing is they did a lot of testing of fuselage inside and out, and they had a lot of positive hits for explosives. And what would happen is when they had positive hits, the FBI would take those pieces and then they would send them to Washington and come back and say, actually, those were false positives. And they kept getting so many hits. We were told this by the bomb tech who was testing the pieces. First, he told us that the Aegis machine testing the explosives for explosives had a lot of false positives. He says we had multiple hits, but this machine had a lot of false positives. And we talked to the head of the FBI lab at the time and to the inventor of the machine, and he said that's just not true. They both said that's just not true. And then what happened is after they started getting more and more hits, they just stopped testing for explosives.
Wow. Yeah, and you originally you were going to get right to the bottom of it, test that seat foam for solid rocket missile fuel, and prove whether a missile was involved in all this. So those eyewitnesses you talked to, they saw something. Some of them thought was a missile come off of the ground. Now this crash happened off the coast of Long Island. So what ground did they see it come off of? What area?
Well, along the coast, somewhere along the
Long
coast,
Island.
and possibly off the water also. Possibly off the water. If you watch our documentary TWA Flight 800, which I think you can watch it on Amazon.
So by the way, viewers, she finally came out with a full documentary on this, investigating it, and I linked the documentary down below. That the video I played at the beginning was the teaser for the documentary,
right.
But I've linked it down below if you guys want to watch. But go on.
That took 17 years. That took 17 years. Yeah. Yes, I mean, we had eyewitnesses who saw it rising out of the water, and we had one a guy who was I forget if he was an assistant principal. His name was Joseph Delgado. He worked for a school, and he was standing there, and he said he heard a thunk, and then he saw something go up fairly close to where he was on the school grounds. So we tried to triangulate somewhat the trajectory of the streaks of light and that caused the explosion, but where exactly we did not report that in the documentary. But the radar evidence showing stuff coming out at Mach 4, also the type of the damage to the interior of the plane, because we had these whistleblowers. We had 5 or 6 people who were high-level members of the original official investigation who came forward and worked with us, me and Tom Stalkup, a brilliant physicist, to review all the evidence and look for more evidence. And of course, when they were working on the official investigation, this is a classic cover-up technique, everything was compartmentalized. And the other thing that's a classic cover-up technique is they were all told, okay, do all your investigating, but we do not want you to write an analysis of what you found. So Hank Hughes, Senior National Transportation Safety Board Aviation Accident Investigator, he said that if he'd been allowed to write his analysis, he said what he found was the damage pattern inside the plane was random. Just random, people here were completely destroyed, people over here more or less intact. And he explained that can only occur with a high energy explosion. He said if it had just been a deflagration, that's the term I was trying to find before, a deflagration, which is a contained explosion in the fuel tank, which was caused by a not very strong, source of energy, which is diesel. Jet A fuel is like kerosene. What you get is a deflagration, which would have a burn pattern very close to where it had exploded, and that wasn't the case. This was a very violent explosion, and there was random damage, and there was random damage also to the and the injuries of the passengers was also quite random. Some people were quite intact, other people were, blown to smithereens.
So let's cut to the big question here. Who would want to intentionally down this plane, and why would the FBI want to cover it up?
I will say this. I do not think, and I believe my colleagues on my team would agree with me, that this was not intentional. So what's being protected here are possibly circumstantial evidence points to big budgets, years and years of research. This is a big government cover-up, and there are several across several agencies. So that tells me that agencies are being protected. They're protecting themselves. They're protecting big budgets that go on over decades, big money, that kind of thing. Because if it had been a terrorist off, and they, tried that whole Stinger missile thing, that's another thing they would do, is they would test for a Stinger missile when they knew that the damage to the fuselage did not indicate that type of missile did it. Okay, so they would do testing that was irrelevant. Like when they tried to blow up the fuel tank to recreate the damage done to the plane. They use butane, which is far more explosive than Jet A fuel, and they just, of course, they could not reproduce what had happened. Anyway, very powerful interests, and this is when I first had to really wrap my mind around the idea that government agencies are like little nations unto themselves, and that they are like a conglomerate of nations when it comes to events like this. They really do protect each other.
So you're saying a government agency may have accidentally missiled this plane?
Well, you have to look at the circumstances what was going on in the area at the time. I mean, that's one of the first things you do is say, well, what was happening here at the time? And there were military exercises going on. I mean, I could get into that chapter and verse, but I'd rather not. I'll just say that. But first, before you look, it's very good to have that, keep that in mind. Yes, military exercises were going on that night, but the most important thing to look at first and foremost is the forensic evidence. And that's what we did. That's what our show is all about. We use the government's own experts, people who were deeply troubled and haunted by the fact that their work was undermined and they were not allowed to do their work properly. And the FBI, that had absolutely no aviation accident experience, none, took over. In fact, Hank Hughes, the National Transportation Safety Board senior accident investigator who's in our show, he had to train them. The other thing is the FBI, which I don't even know why they don't do it for their own cases. The FBI, it writes summaries of what eyewitnesses say. It does not faithfully record every word that eyewitnesses say. It's the weirdest thing. Wow. Whereas the National Transportation Safety Board does. So from the very beginning, allowing the FBI to come in and take over, was part of the cover-up.
Wow. Yeah, and just for the anniversary of this crash, you had Hank Hughes, NTSB, on your radio show. I was going to play a clip from that where he talks about the FBI just kind of appearing and getting involved. Here it is.
For every NTSB investigator, there were probably 50 or 60 FBI and ATF agents, and I don't say that I think that's accurate. That it was amazing to see the number of people. Nobody came out from the FBI and said, "Hey, we're in charge." They just acted like they were, and basically, they were the guys carrying the guns.
So, yeah, by the way, you can listen to that whole radio interview linked down in my description. I got all Kristina's links in there. Okay, so a lot of my viewers asked about the passenger list because a lot of people are still wondering if the FBI was so desperate to cover this up. Was there someone on that plane that the government wanted to get rid of?
Well,
bring up Washington. What was it? The Washington Post has a list of the passengers. I'm going to bring that list up on my screen as you talk about it.
Nothing points to that, and I'll tell you why. Nothing points to that, because in the beginning, by the way, the FBI really was gung ho to get to the truth of the matter. It wasn't. It was all of a sudden that Jim Kallstrom, who was in charge of the FBI's investigation, he did an about face because he was looking for a bomb. He thought it was a bomb. Okay. All of a sudden he did an about face, and the CIA did this animation that I told you about, this fraudulent animation. And by the way, there was a guy inside the National Transportation Safety Board, a relatively new employee named David Mayer, who worked with the CIA on these eyewitness on this eyewitness animation. Okay. And then he was the one, by the way, who testified after they do, the National Transportation Safety Board does an investigation. They have what's called a sunshine hearing where they talk about all their research and they give their conclusion. David Mayer, for some reason, all of a sudden was the one to give the eyewitness. He gave the eyewitness report, even though he wasn't the chairman of the eyewitness committee. He gives the eyewitness report. And what does he do? He takes two main witnesses, Joseph Delgado and another guy, Meyer, okay, who was a Vietnam helicopter pilot in Vietnam. Anyway, he takes these two guys who are main witnesses and he misrepresents their accounts so that they cannot, so he can say, yeah, they didn't see anything that looked anything like a missile, even though they both did. So, and David Mayer, another thing that he did, he was in charge of a database that was supposed to document where all the pieces of the plane fell, which is very important because the first pieces, they had three debris fields, where the first pieces fell and then where the next ones and the next ones. And by that, you can sort of tell how the plane broke up, and it can give you clues about what happened and what kind of force hit the plane. And he changed some tags around, okay, so that it would better fit the government's exploding fuel tank scenario. So there was all kinds of shenanigans. Some of the people who were going to talk at the sunshine hearing, some of the investigators and parties to the investigation were threatened to shut up, okay, by the NTSB's investigator in charge. The FBI and the CIA made sure that no eyewitnesses testified and that the NTSB did not have access to the eyewitnesses directly, only to the FBI's 302 summaries. And even those were probably edited. So the whole thing is just a travesty. it's not only fraud, waste, and abuse. They literally use the taxpayers' money against the taxpayer.
Oh my gosh. That's just so horrifying. And it's just so fascinating. You think that these huge media corporations, a lot of viewers still think that these journalists are news hounds who are going to get to the bottom of the truth and hold the powerful accountable.
They're not allowed to. They're not allowed to, and they know it. They know it.
Do most media insiders know that? I think a lot of them spend many years in there. I know I did. I spent many years in the corporate news, thinking that when that big investigation came to me, that I would be able to hold the powerful accountable. And I think each one kind of finds out where their limits lie on that.
Well, after this happened to me, I did publish a book called Into the Buzzsaw, Leading Journalists Expose the Myth of a Free Press. Instead of just doing Kristina's little story, I knew people would say, oh, she was just disgruntled or whatever. I decided to gather a bunch of accounts by investigative reporters talking about running into censorship. And Gary Webb, I don't know if you know who he was, but Gary Webb was the one who exposed CIA drug dealing in Los Angeles, crack cocaine, their connection to the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. And he was hounded. He was the first reporter to actually put all his backup documents and evidence on the internet. So it was a huge, it sparked congressional hearings and everything. He ended up killing himself. They literally hounded him to death. But in my book, his account is the only first person account of what happened to him. And so this book, when it came out, I was actually quite terrified because I thought, oh my God, people are going to come after me. But I think the whole journalism world was really shocked to see how vast the censorship mechanism is in this country. And I don't know if it's because your generation, you're young. I guess when you get in,
I'm still naive or was recently.
Well, you really want to, I believed, I was a true believer. I can't even describe what I went through. I was in the fetal position after what happened to me at CBS. And then I decided to get up and fight and expose it. But it took a hot minute, because it's so shocking. And then you realize it's so big.
Yeah.
And you have to just keep plugging away. That's why I have these 2 radio shows, because I just feel like, okay, I've got to keep going. Somehow this people have to keep understanding what the facts are, keep giving the truth to the people, and more people are, I think, wising up to what's going on.
How is it, do you think, that all the media outlets are controlled? All of these major news corporations.
Oh, well, one way is, the FCC. It's happened. In my second book, Feet to the Fire, which is about how reporters, again, firsthand interviews with reporters, news executives, et cetera, talking about being intimidated when it came to trying to report the truth on the lying that went on to get us into the war in Iraq. Okay. I think it was Jim Bamford who said, investigative reporter, really, really interesting guy. Basically, they say, look, if the FCC regulates television, and if they don't, that's the government's lever of power against the TV business.
So you think the FCC is threatening news?
It has in the past. I think definitely it has. It'll review your licenses and so on and so forth. Things have changed since then because there's so many outlets. The media landscape has changed so much because of new technology. Now I think and of course there were always the business interests. Who is paying a lot of the corporate TV bills right now? It's big pharma. That's why you can't report on the sea illness, as you like to call it.
Right.
The sea illness and the V things.
Yeah, the
that
needle.
The needle. You can't talk about that. Okay?
Right.
Because if you turn on your TV, who's paying everybody's salary? Big Pharma.
Yeah.
So that's the connection.
I was wondering if that is what it was with Fox. I know, after I blew the whistle on Fox's corruption, you interviewed me and you said you could relate with your story. Both of us being reporters on the ground, censored. And I always wondered, people always asked me why my bosses censored me. And I didn't know, I still don't know who was controlling my bosses. But I know my bosses were getting pressure in Houston, we're getting pressure from New York.
Well, yes. I mean, the executives who are looking at the bottom line, who are looking at the money, the income flow.
Whether pharmaceutical companies would pull their ads out.
Of course they would pull their ads.
Because my coverage was drug related.
Yes.
Yeah. Could be.
Yes, of course. So and nowadays too, you have to understand business and government are completely business has captured, it's called regulatory capture, have captured virtually all the major agencies that could affect them. Okay. So this is where we are right now. That's why you and I are talking here on your show, which is on StreamYard.
Right. Okay, we got this super chat. Amazing guest, super interesting, great interview. Thank you. Yes, Kristina's amazing. She's got her own YouTube channel and BitChute. Link down in description for both of those.
The BitChute is the complete, because YouTube has censored me a couple of times. So there are certain programs I do on the needle and the C and now the M.
Okay, monkeypox. I haven't been censored yet for saying monkeypox, so I'm going to say it on YouTube.
Okay.
But yeah, I know we've gone over time right now, but before you leave, if you have time, I want to ask you about your monkeypox coverage, because you have some very interesting guests on your show who talked about smallpox and monkeypox. Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, Dr. Meryl Nass, who is, among many things, she treats patients with the illness. She's an internist. They're trying to yank her medical license because she is a proponent of early treatment for the C illness. Also writes, and she's also an epidemic analyst. And first thing, we were talking about how the interesting thing about monkeypox is generally when you have an epidemic beginning, it comes out of somewhere and it spreads from there. So you can see this, the spread makes sense. But monkeypox, it appeared like this, boop, 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 all these different places. And what Meryl said was, this is an indication that monkeypox was in a test tube. It moved around in a test tube. So I thought that was interesting. And the other thing about monkeypox is the US government has a huge stockpile of vaccines for monkeypox that were bought. I think it was, did Obama? I think Obama bought this drug and paid 180% above the price that had been previously paid for smallpox vaccines. So I just did a recent interview with Meryl that people should watch on the Whistleblower Newsroom. It's all the Whistleblower Newsroom, one word, on bitchute.com.
Link down in the description.
Okay. Where she talks about, this is a money-making proposition for Big Pharma and for the government. Okay. Because they commission these scenes to give to Medicare patients and so on. And, who knows who gets money also along the way for these buys. So the whole thing is kind of scandalous because the needles are dangerous. They're not safe. And there hasn't been enough testing on one of them. There hasn't been any human testing on it.
The new monkeypox needle.
Yes.
No human testing yet.
No human testing. And the other thing is that monkeypox is not, first of all, there are not that many cases. And secondly, it's not a terrible disease. It's you get these symptoms. I think they're sort of
like chicken pox. I think it's like these welts on
you get a flu-like illness followed by a rash that resolves, she said. So it's nothing terrible. And so this whole, there's this constant drumbeat of fear that they're trying to generate. It's monkeypox. It is back. Now we have this new variant and that new variant. And of course, people don't realize that with viruses over time become weaker and weaker and weaker. And also, even with flu, like the flu scene, they don't really know what the next variant is going to be. I mean, they make up a scene based on what they think it might be. This brings you into a larger question, which obviously we don't have the time to go into. What scenes should be mandatory from cradle to grave, and which ones should not? There should be, I think, a gigantic review of all that. But
well, my perspective as a free American is 0 needles should be mandatory.
I agree. I agree with you. I think that every time somebody is confronted with a needle, they should be told, okay, this is for this, and this is it can do this to your body, it could do that to your body. And I'll tell you, there is something weird going on, because what's happening is the immune systems of our children are wonky. And nobody officially wants to look at the possible connection between things and immunological illnesses that have just skyrocketed in this country. As a matter of fact, there was a recent Chinese study that said that children in the United States, that autism has risen 50% since 2017. Meryl now did talk about how there should be a sane review of things, and we should not be vaccinating little tiny babies when their immune systems are just, we should protect our immune systems. Our immune systems are geniuses. They're the ones that can really heal us. Yes, sometimes with help, but now that you have, ever since Big Pharma has been allowed to advertise on TV, now they want to take over our immune systems because there's a lot of money in that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your coverage is necessary, I think. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing with my viewers what you're up to, asking these questions that the corporate news refuses to ask. Thank you so much for going over on time with me. It's been a fascinating conversation with you.
My pleasure, Ivory.
And again, viewers, you can look directly at what she's talking about with her monkeypox coverage and other coverage, link down in my description. Kristina, all the best to you, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your work too, Ivory.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll talk soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye.